Happy Thursday, everybody. It's really great to see you all start joining, and we're going to wait just a little bit for people to settle in, get connected. Make sure you have your cup of coffee. I'm going to go ahead and start our first poll. There are two. So here's our first one while you're waiting so patiently. If you've attended one of our webinars before, you know the drill, but we're always curious to see what's bringing you to today's webinar. Is it educational? Are you in the beginning stages of your third-party risk program? Are you a current prevalent customer? I know I saw some of you guys this morning already in that boat, so just let me know. I'm going to leave that poll up there while I get a little bit of an intro started. We have a very special guest here, Tom Rogers. As you can see, he's the founder of Vendor Centric, which is probably what drove you here in the first place. And he is, considered a thought leader on vendor lifecycle management and a trusted advisor to organizations all over the US. We also have Scott Lang, our very own VP of Product Marketing here at Prevalent, as well as myself. My name is Melissa. I work in business development, and I'm usually the one who will follow up with you after this webinar. I've chatted with some of you before, I'm sure. So if not me, you will hear from Amanda or Landon or Noel. So be on the lookout for them. And today, Tom will dig into the topic entitled, How to Bridge the Gap Between Third-Party Risk and Contract Management. As a quick reminder, we want to value your time, so just feel free to use the Q&A for those burning questions. They will get lost in the chat, so ensure you are utilizing that Q&A. This is also being recorded, so you'll get this in your inbox later today or tomorrow. And lastly, you're all muted. So use the chat if you need to communicate something that's not for the Q&A box. Other than that, I'll pause this poll and I will let our expert Tom take over.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Melissa. And welcome, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you're coming in from. As Melissa mentioned, I'm Tom Rogers. I'll be your guide through today's webinar. And the topic we'll be covering is really bridging the gap between third-party risk and contract management. But really, we'll be talking also kind of holistically around thinking about other components of how you're managing vendors in addition to risk and contract and all those other pieces that fit in, because this topic isn't just about third-party risk and contract. It's really about holistically managing those vendor relationships. I'll be talking specifically about some areas where risk and contract tie in, but this whole topic around a more holistic approach to vendor management is a big area right now, as a lot of organizations are either getting something started and up and running off the ground, or they've got an existing program and they're trying to take it to the next level. So let me give you kind of a quick overview of what I'll be covering today in the webinar. So there's really three goals I've got. One would be giving you a sense of where TPRM and contract lifecycle management align along the life cycle of kind of managing those relationships with third parties. So where do those pieces come together, right? And then as you think about where those pieces come together, what are the types of control points that you can put into place to really help create better alignment between contract and management and third-party risk management? And what does that look like? And then lastly, as you're looking to potentially put some of these control points in place, where does that fit within the overall governance structure of managing those vendor and third-party relationships to make sure that the types of things that you do as you want to enhance controls and create better alignment kind of stick, right? And that's where the governance piece comes in. And I'll talk about that a little bit on the back end. I've got the webinar is kind of broken down into two parts. The first part is really talking about the kind of the why and the what, and the back part really talking about the how. And so as Melissa mentioned, if you have questions along the way, just pop them into chat. There'll be some natural points in which we'll break for questions, but Melissa will pop in if there's something that comes up that she wants to bring up as well. Okay. So with that as a background, let's just hop in. So the first part here I want to talk about is really why it makes sense to align and kind of where those key alignment parts are. in that contract management relationship. So the way we think about contracting is really, it's broken down into two parts, right? So you kind of have all the things that you do on the front end of a relationship with a new third party. So that can include everything from sourcing, going out and finding somebody, determining who you want to work with. It can include diligence on that third party. So doing those risk assessments and diligence on them before you go into contracting. And it also includes, the process for negotiating those contracts and deals. So all those things that happen on the front end, those pre-contract activities. Then once you get those contracts in place, right? And then it becomes all the activities related to managing those relationships. So it's SLA management, it's managing to deliverables, invoices, things like that. But it also includes things like managing contract modifications when there's changes to scope. And it includes also on the back end, making sure that once a contract is done and terminated, that there's a way to close it out and kind of remove that contract and do it in a structured way so that you're offboarding the relationship. So that contract management piece isn't just once the contract signed, it's all the things that get done on the front end and all the things that get done on the back end, right? So there's a lot of stuff that happens as you're managing these contracts with the third parties. So when you think about risk really presents itself throughout that whole relationship, right? So there's pre-contract risk and diligence that needs to be done to evaluate what you're getting into and making sure those risks are identified and appropriately mitigated. And then there's the ongoing monitoring of those risks on the back end, right? And making sure that as things come up, that there's alignment there and that those risks are being managed and mitigated and effectively dealt with as part of the general management of the contract too. So risk doesn't just happen at a point in time, it really happens through that whole relationship from end to end. So it's important that those risk activities and these contracting activities all kind of come together and have tight alignment. But what we typically find in a lot of our clients and the organizations that we're working with is that there are lots of gaps that happen along the way where misalignment can occur and risk and contracting aren't working together, right? So let me give you a couple quick practical examples of where we see that and where some of these common gaps are. And I'll focus really around this diligence piece here, because this is probably what a lot of people are doing right now. So think about when you're entering into a contract, right? Everybody's got standard contract provisions. This is one in which it was from a client of ours, and it's around a term and termination provision. And you can see on the bottom part here, there's an actual requirement that they have for the vendor that they're working with, that vendor is going to return, request, or delete with written certification of deletion any protected information in their control. And they even go on to say that any protected information in possession of their affiliates and subcontractors, right? So you think about the typical contract process. We've got a contract, we're negotiating with this third party, we're asking them to comply with this. So where risk comes in is, hey, we've got to make sure that this third party has the necessary policies and controls to live up to the requirement. Oftentimes, though, these contractual requirements go into place and there may not have been a full risk assessment that's actually done around these contractual requirements. Risk assessments get done kind of in their own silo. Contract standards and provisions get done in their silo, and there's not a connection between the two. So what's important here and where gaps occur is when organizations have standard contract terms, they're not aligned to the risk assessment procedures that are done. And so something's missing in here in this part of the process. And then if you look at this bottom part here where they're requiring this of their affiliates and subcontractors, part of this risk assessment needs to ensure that they're evaluating this vendor's management of their own third parties, right? So how does this vendor kind of go through and manage their third parties? Are they require those third parties to have contractual provisions that align to what the actual client is requiring of them, and that those all flow down throughout the process, right? So this is one area in where we see that there are definite gaps that happen where, vendors are being requested to comply with certain contractual requirements, but the risk assessments don't always support their ability to know whether they have the right policies and procedures to do it. So that's one area. The kind of the flip side of that would be in cases where you're doing a risk assessment, and do the residual risks that come out of that risk assessment actually make their way into the contract, right? So in this case, this is another example from a client. They're a large international NGO, and they have requirements to kind of receive and evaluate financial statements for certain types of third parties that they work with. So you can see down here, they have a due diligence question where they ask whether the third party had any significant deficiencies or material findings in their most recent audit report. So the risk assessment is, did they find anything? If they do, though, what makes its way from that risk assessment into the actual contract? And this is another gap that we see occur where the folks that are actually managing the risk assessment process, whether it's the vendor management office, third-party risk, maybe it's finance is doing this, maybe it's InfoSec is finding something up here. There's communication between those that are doing the risk assessment, those that are negotiating and actually creating the contract to ensure that these risks that need to get remediated make their way into the contractual language, right? So these are just a couple of gaps that we see on a regular basis where risk and contracting really need to be aligned, and oftentimes there's not. So either language doesn't make its way into the contract or certain risk assessment procedures are not done. So the way we kind of talk about, all right, so what do you do and how do you start to close some of these gaps, is really by creating structure that aligns contract management with third-party risk management. And that's where a framework comes in. And so a framework enables you to really bring together operationally all the different components of managing that vendor relationship. So contract and third-party risks don't live individually. They actually come together under a common structure and common framework in how they're managed, right? So there's lots of different frameworks out there for managing third parties. This is ours and the one we use. And as you can see on the just to kind of orient you as to how this is set up. So on the outer ring here, we kind of have the life cycle stages. So basically the different activities and flow that goes through in managing the third parties, right? All the way from sourcing to doing risk assessments and due diligence, through contracting and onboarding that vendor or third party, making purchases, doing ongoing management and monitoring, all the way through termination and offboarding, right? So the stages kind of are the different activities that need to get managed that are inclusive of third-party risk and contracts. And then the inner part is really operational governance that holds it all together. So these are where you're creating policies and standards, right? So not standalone policies for contract and not standalone policies for risk, but really policies for managing that end-to-end relationship, supported by standards, supported by procedures, supported by the people skills and training that need to get the work done, the technology and reporting that you need, all the way through kind of oversight and management of everything as well. So this framework creates kind of I guess the glue or the structure that kind of pulls everything together and helps to support that alignment of the third-party risk activities with the contract management activities, right? But within the framework and within these different areas, there are really certain key points that are really important to align contract and third-party risk management together, excuse me. Because while they happen throughout the whole process, there's specific points in which third-party risk and contract management really come together. And that's where the alignment truly needs to happen. So as you think about the framework, and as you think about where those points are, there's three that are really important. So one obviously is when you're doing the initial risk assessment and you're doing the contract development, right? and I talked to that kind of on the early stage there, is that not only do we need to make sure that any contractual provisions that we're requiring the vendor to comply with are kind of evaluated from a due diligence standpoint, but that anything that comes up from a residual risk standpoint also makes its way into contract when contractual language is required. So this is a key point of alignment. The second key point of alignment between risk and contracting is once that contract's up and running, kind of the ongoing management and monitoring of both risk and contract performance, and making sure that there's the right procedures that are established and the right communication that's happening to kind of take risks that come up and take contractual issues that come up and have those folks coordinate on those to manage those effectively as well. Then the last area of alignment is really on the back end here, and that's the termination and offboarding. And I think as I think about the types of organizations that we're working with, a lot of them are, we have some clients with some mature programs, but we have a lot of clients that are just on the front end of this and just getting things going. And I think this last piece, this kind of termination and offboarding, is where we see the least maturity out of most of our clients. There's no formal structure in place to go through and really ensure that all contractual obligations have been met. And as importantly, that all those risk pieces that are still in the contract, like data destruction, like maybe return of or transfer of intellectual property, things like that, that happens in an organized and structured way, so that so there's a de-risking of that relationship, right? So that's a key point of alignment in the life cycle as well. So really, as we think about where can contract and third-party risk come together in a much better way, it's these three places that we really focus on, and then really determine what types of practical processes and controls should be in place to help support that alignment better. And so that's what I'm going to kind of start getting into on the back end of the presentation here. But I wanted to just pause for a second. Melissa, I know some things have been coming in through chat a little bit, and see if there might be any questions so far.
Nothing too pressing at this very moment. Everyone's just excited to get a hold of the slides at the very end. So I'll defer to you on that and see what you're comfortable with. But so far, positive engagement. So I'll let you continue.
Okay, awesome. So that's kind of the high level stuff, right? We've got, there's a why to connect third-party risk with contracting. There's different points in the relationship that are really critical to make those connections. So now it's a matter of, all right, so what do we do? How do we make these connections better? What are some of the control points that are important? And that's what I want to kind of just focus on the second part of the presentation here. So I've got kind of 4 control points I wanted to go through with you. And I'll start with the first one here, which is really contract approval. So as we think about that, I'm just going to go back for 1 second. So we think about this initial risk assessment and contracting here. It's like, how do we make sure that all the residual risks have made their way into the contract? And the best way to do that is to have a good control point during that contract approval process, right? Because that will help ensure that the residual risks kind of get remediated. We're looking through contractual language to make sure that they're in there and everything is kind of buttoned down before you actually execute that agreement with the vendor. So practically how that happens is through some type of control during the approval process. So what you're looking at here, I've pulled some illustrations out just to share with you guys. This one is a sample form from one of our clients. It's a large insurance company. They've actually automated this, so it's not a manual form, but the form, basically when they get to the approval of a contract, they go through a process of kind of collecting some basic information about the contract to start building out the profile, executive summary, contract name, things like that. But you can see down here in this bottom section before the contract gets approved, they're also doing some things around governance and risk management for the contractual relationship going forward. And so what they want to do here is not only make sure that that the residual risks make their way into the contractual language, but they also want to make sure that there's a control to do things like assign a contract owner, which is this designated relationship manager, right? So they actually ensure that somebody post-contract is responsible for actually managing those deliverables and actually calling them out and assigning that responsibility, which sounds like pretty basic stuff, but in a lot of cases, there's a lot of uncertainty and confusion about who actually owns that relationship and that contract. And so tightening that up here to make sure that they're responsible for kind of risk oversight, contractual oversight happens here. And they do some other things here as well around segmenting, risk assessment was done. And then this last piece here in the red part is really making sure that there's a step in the process that, in this case, it's their vendor management office. They're actually verifying that the risk assessment was done, that residual risk analysis was made. And if there's anything that came out of that analysis, it needs to make its way into the contract was done. So the VMO kind of does this sign off. And if there's any issues they come up with, they're the ones that are kind of the quarterback spearhead figuring out what needs to get done before that final contract approval. Melissa, I saw you popped up.
Got a question for you. So one of the biggest challenges I typically see is with contracting and due diligence either being done in parallel or contracting to commence after a green light assessment, which can take time, which is the issue there. In your view, what's the cleanest method for contracting/assessing, either in parallel where the agreement can be negotiated but cannot be signed until assessment concludes, or a waterfall approach where contracting does not commence until all assessment due diligence has been sanctioned or approved?
Wow, that was a really good, well-written question. That was great.
I didn't write it, so.
Yeah, no, that was great. Awesome question. So here's my 2 cents. I think practically they go in parallel, right? So look, business owners need stuff. They can't wait for a full due diligence to be done to start negotiating a contractual agreement. So practically what we typically see happen and what we generally recommend is that contracting go hand in hand with the due diligence, right? So that you can move these things along, but there be a final check and a pause at the end to make sure that the contract can actually be executed and signed until there's an approval process and diligence has been completed and any residual risks have been addressed as well. So we typically see that they go in parallel and think that's the most practical way to deal with that.
Perfect. And do you have time for one more?
Sure.
An easy one for you. What does vendor segmentation mean?
Okay, in this case, vendor segmentation is really their risk, risk tiering. So they use a high, medium, and low risk tier that comes out of their inherent risk assessment. And so that's what they've established here. This was a manual process. They basically created the form and then they put the form into their software platform to automate everything. So that the risk assessment gets done, the risk tiering gets done automatically, but they wanted a placeholder to make sure that that was included in the profile of the vendor.
Perfect. All right, I'll let you continue.
Sure. Hopefully that answered those two questions. So thanks, guys. Keep the questions coming. That's helpful. So this first control point around contract approval is important. This is where we're aligning contracting with the risk piece. So some keys to think about here. So one of which is to make sure that the process is actually documented, right? So a lot of times the misalignment that happens and the gaps happen because there is no documented process and there's no clarity on roles and responsibilities and who's to do what. So documentation of that and being clear on the process with a supporting form or workflow is really important, right? Secondly is also in a best case scenario would be to also have contractual standards that kind of match back to some of your most common residual risks that come up, so that, for example, if somebody, if you're going in and you're doing a risk assessment, and you would normally expect that the vendor would have a SOC report, and let's say they don't have a SOC audit, kind of what are you going to do, right? So there's probably some additional diligence that you might do, but you also might have some contractual language that says, you're allowed to come out for an on-site visit, things like that, right? So if you know what those contractual standards are when some of your most common residual risks arise, you make that process a lot smoother, and it makes it much easier to kind of bake those into the contract once your risk assessment is done. So that's a second thing. And then the third thing is that making sure not only is the risk assessment process documented, but that contract review and approval process is documented as well. And so, where the misalignment can happen is if you've got third-party risk policies and procedures and contract management policies and procedures. Our approach and how we work with our clients is we bring everything together into one set of holistic policies and procedures for managing the end-to-end relationship. So that includes everything from sourcing, through risk assessments, through contracting and onboarding, oversight, all the way through the back end contract termination and offboarding as well. So to the extent that you can not only define these, but bring them together into one holistic view of managing that end-to-end relationship, that really helps as well. But documentation here and having these standards is a big part of supporting this contract approval control. Okay, so that's control point one, and that's dealing with the front end prior to entering into a contract. The second control point that I wanted to talk about is really on the contract management side, and once the relationship begins, right? So here's where we want to have a process in place to kind of communicate and escalate risks that present during contract management. And this is where we see a lot that communication starts to break down, because you've got different people in different roles in different departments within the organization. They're doing different types of oversight and monitoring and management of either risk or the contract, and they're not kind of talking to each other, and there's no process to be able to support them to do it, right? So in this case, this is just a screenshot. This is actually from the Prevalent platform that monitors certain types of risks, right? So, in this case, you might have a vendor that's being monitored, and some issues came up around regulatory and legal risks. So what do? And who's monitoring this? So is this the vendor management office that's monitoring it, or third-party risk? Is this compliance that's monitoring it? Is it the business owner, right? So who's kind of monitoring the different pieces that happen during contract management? And how do you have a system and a process to be able to bring those together to kind of make some decisions and escalate them? So the alignment here is really about creating structure to this process and being clear on who's monitoring what and how to escalate issues as they come up. So some of the keys that we kind of talk about here during this contract management process, again, it gets back to roles and responsibilities on who's doing the monitoring. And this is especially for newer programs, as they're trying to figure out kind of the roles of different subject matter experts, and who looks at financial statements versus who monitors systems like this versus who's monitoring information security risks, things like that. Is creating those roles and responsibilities as to who has those responsibilities, as well as the contract and the service level agreements and deliverables, which is typically the business owner. So clarifying those is key. And then once you've clarified those, being able to have systems that when those risks come up, when those issues come up, that they actually can be either automatically identified in the system, and then communications kind of go out to provide line of sight to all the different stakeholders involved, or a way that if a risk presents itself and needs to be, say, manually entered into a system, like a contract problem, that it can actually do that, be entered into the system, and then some communication to go out to provide visibility to all the different stakeholders as well. Because it's all about providing line of sight and keeping those communications open as to what's going on. And then once things come up, it's really figuring out, all right, so is this issue something that needs to be dealt with or not? And if it is, who kind of runs point on all of that? And this is a big challenge for a lot of organizations, especially if folks are trying to push it down to the business owners, because the business owners are typically not going to be the ones to know how to deal with a lot of the issues that come up. They're not information security experts. They're not financial health experts, right? So who runs point to actually determine when a risk requires escalation and how it gets dealt with? Our approach is that should really be centralized somewhere within the vendor management office or the third-party risk group, and that they should be the quarterback to figure out what to do with that and to get the right people involved in the process, so that you've got all the right stakeholders that can kind of come together, make decisions, and decide what they want to do. But having the vendor management office or third-party risk office, whatever you might have in your organization, kind of be the quarterback to do that, right? So they're running point to figure out how to get the risk dealt with. And that might mean contract modifications, right? Or it may, in worst case scenario, potentially mean contract termination. So the last key around risks that might come up during contract management and how to deal with them is if you have risks that can potentially be dealt with through some additional controls, great. If there's requirements you need to place on the third party to be able to do that through mods in the contract, but you also want to have a way that if something does come up that is beyond your risk appetite, that's really going to create an issue, that the contract vehicle needs to have a way for you to be able to get out of it when that happens. The most common way to do that is through some type of termination for convenience language. Generally, there's always stuff in the contract for termination for cause. But you want to give yourself some flexibility here in the contract, that if there's something that just can't be mitigated and you need to get out, you need to have the ability to do that. So this control point is all around when risks present, how do you kind of centralize them? How do you have line of sight to the right stakeholders? Who should be the quarterback to figure out what to do with them? And then how do you modify or get out of the relationship if you need to? So these 4 keys kind of support this whole contract management control point here. Okay. I'll pause there. Melissa, any questions on that?
Yes, actually perfect timing. In your experience, who usually owns the ultimate decision to accept a certain level of risk, and then parentheses flagged by DD, and that end up contracted? Is it business holders? Does legal or a TPRM team have a veto right? Is there a risk committee?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. Honestly, it's all over the place. And it depends, I think, partly on the size of the organization and the maturity. Ultimately, it needs to be, depending on what the risk is. So there should be a process in place for the appropriate stakeholders to make decisions on whether to accept the risk or not. And so whether that be, it could be a committee. So some of our clients have risk committees or third-party risk committees where when risk presents itself that can't be resolved by, say, the VMO and the business owner, it escalates to that committee, and then they can collectively make that decision. So that might be, so the committee might include folks from vendor management or third-party risk, compliance, potentially legal, InfoSec. There's different folks that can be on that committee. A lot of our clients, though, don't have as much structure. I think that's typically reserved for larger, more mature organizations. So they do it in a little bit more of an ad hoc way. And usually the way that happens is that whoever's running point in the vendor management office is responsible for bringing together the right stakeholders based on what the risk is. And then collectively, those stakeholders make that decision together. So the business owner is really not making that decision. They obviously have to have a say in that. but we don't want them making a decision around something that is like an information security risk, right? We really need InfoSec to have a role in that, or compliance risk or something like that. So it's that VMO that kind of runs point that brings those stakeholders together. And that's typically more on an ad hoc basis as those needs arise. But what they do is they identify who all the stakeholders are in their roles so that when those issues escalate, they know who that ad hoc group is that comes together. So that's a long answer. I'd say I've seen it both ways. I see less of the committee structure unless you're really a larger, more mature organization that's doing that.
Perfect. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Melissa. And thanks for the question. All right. So let's see. How are we doing on time here? All right. So let's go through. I'm going to go through the next two control points, and then I'll pause for questions there. And I've got one thing to kind of finalize on the back end. So the control point 3 here. All right. So we talked about risk that present. So what about contract mods, right? This is an area where I think it's easy to have a gap that comes up, especially primarily when there's a scope change, right? So what we're concerned with here is that a business owner goes through and does a contract mod that changes the scope of the relationship, that may bring more risk into the organization based on the scope change, right? And if there's more risk that's brought into the organization, there needs to be an alignment and a pause with third-party risk to say, hey, we're making the scope change. We're adding, let's just say we hired a vendor to do a project, and now we want to outsource something to them, right? Or we hired a vendor to do some initial consulting work, and now we're going to be buying software from them. So that scope change creates a different relationship, potentially with more risks. If you're outsourcing something, or if you're leveraging technology, maybe the front end diligence that you didn't include those aspects because they weren't present in the initial scope of work, but in the new scope of work, they are. So this modification alignment is important here. And it's basically saying, hey, look, when we have a contract modification, there needs to be a process in place to kind of stop, see what the scope change is, and whether it changes the nature of the relationship to the extent that we need to reassess the risk, right? So in this example, this is just kind of a sample change order from one of our clients again. And they've made some change where they're licensing and implementing some software, right? I kind of clean this up. But that would be one example. So what we really need to do is pause, make sure that whoever's managing the contract mod notifies risk that the mod is happening, and that they're able to get together and really say, what's the details of the scope change? Is it enough that it's changing the inherent risk that we're accepting? And do we need to go through and do additional level of due diligence based on this modification, right? So that's what we're getting at there and what we want the control to be. So some of the keys here, again, process, making sure there's a documented process for contract mods, right? And that there's also a process to go through and redo that inherent risk assessment to see whether there's new risks that need to be assessed based on the scope change. And that if there are new risks, and if the due diligence shows that there's some residual risks that need to be remediated, right, that we bake that into the contract. So it's a similar process that we talked about before. It's just happening for the modifications, right? So that's a control point that's important around the mods. And now as we work our way through the relationship, we're on the back end, and you're getting towards termination, whether the termination is proactive, where you're doing it because of a breach or for convenience, or whether it's just naturally expiring, is that last control point that we want to get in place, which is to make sure that as the contract winds down, whatever risks remain are kind of being alleviated from the relationship to the extent that you can, as the contract obligations are being closed out as well, right? So this was the same example I showed you guys earlier around term and termination, where we've got this, they have to delete, let's see, return or delete with a written certification, all the PI, right? So in this case, risk needs to be aligned with contracting to make sure that this was actually done, they get the attestation, and that risk can kind of be removed from the relationship, and that third party either no longer has that data, right? Or that they've returned it, right? And that they've attested that they've done it as well. So syncing up on here is really around making sure that there's a formalized documented process. You can sense a theme here, right? Documentation. And then also, as you're thinking about, one of the things I didn't mention is based on the nature of the relationship from a risk standpoint, you also want to make sure that if this is a critical vendor, right, that you're terminating, that you should have a contingency plan in place already for the vendor, and that the contingency plan was enacted prior to termination. So if you're winding down that relationship of somebody that you've outsourced something to, or if they're providing a key software, right, that there's already been some discussion and planning in place on how you're either have a new vendor in place to kind of handle that outsourcing and provide the software. Maybe you're going to bring some of that in-house so that there's no risk to pausing or creating problems with operations with that vendor's contract being terminated, right? And we've seen some issues with this before where something happened with a vendor, somebody moved quickly to terminate, and then the client was left with a major disruption to their operations that they had to quickly try to resolve. So contingency plans are important here. Also, a lot of focus with risk management and risk assessments is around data, but remember there's lots of non-data risks that need to be addressed as well. So that might be transfer of intellectual property, if there is any, something as simple as badging, right? So did a vendor have access to your office, right? Okay, get the badge back so they no longer have access, or turn off those rights. So all these things should be factored into a formal termination and closeout process that's documented, right? And then there should be some final control in place. Again, this is oftentimes the vendor management office can be the quarterback on this. The business owner might be kind of running it and responsible for it, but somebody needs to just make sure that everything's done. And while organizations will try to push that on the business owner, practically it just won't happen because they either have too many things on their plate or they're not going to be held accountable for it. So if you have a function like a VMO that can support this, it's great if they can kind of provide that final check as well to make sure all these things are done and you've de-risked that relationship, as well as got all the contract deliverables and obligations that vendor was responsible to do. So creating that, connecting those dots around de-risking and offboarding the contract here at the end is important. Okay, so that kind of, in summary of those control points, as you think about that life cycle, right? We've got here during contracting and onboarding, we need an approval process where the risk and third party, where risk and contract management come together. Again, around contract management, when risks present, they need to be escalated. And how does that make its way into the contract if needed? The third one is around the modifications. If there's scope changes that need to be addressed, they are in the contract. And then lastly, it's making sure as the contract winds down, all the kind of the de-risking activities happen in concert with that as well. Okay. So that's my my thoughts on kind of where the alignment's really important between third-party risk and contracting. Some of the things you can do from a control standpoint to support that. Obviously, all the stuff really needs to be baked into some type of structure that kind of is the glue that holds it together. So it's not just done on an ad hoc way. And so that kind of is a good segue into my last point, which is really around, all right, so as you think about all the different places where you need to make that alignment. How do you make sure they kind of fit together, right? And stick. And that's where this governance comes into play. So this is kind of the inner side, the inner circle of the framework that I showed you earlier, where really it's the glue that ends up holding all those activities together. So when I talked a lot about documentation, policies, and procedures, again, bringing everything together into one common set of policies and procedures for managing these vendor and third-party relationships. That's where you can start to really get alignment between CLM. Don't treat them as separate. Bring them together into a common set of policies, standards, and procedures, right? Secondly is a lot of our clients find this very helpful is you're starting to build out roles and responsibilities. One way is to kind of make that more granular with a lot more clarity is to create RACI charts. And RACI charts are simply, the RACI stands for responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. And it's just a way to really define what stakeholders are involved in different parts of the process around contract and third-party management, what they're supposed to be doing. Are they responsible for something, or should they just be consulted and informed? And creating that clarity so everybody knows what their roles are throughout third-party risk and contracting, right? Then a third piece here on the governance piece that helps hold it together is to really establish and integrate systems around managing vendors, both from a risk and contract management standpoint. And so that could either be, two different systems that kind of come and talk together. So you have one source of truth, right? Or it could be one single system that allows you to support both those contract and third-party risk management activities, which would make it even easier. But you can't have contract systems and third-party systems live separately. They should be coming together to create a cohesive source of truth view for that relationship and all those activities that need to be involved. And then on the backside here, you think about kind of the structural stuff, there's just making sure that there's the appropriate oversight and reporting. So that gets back to, do you have a risk committee or not? Or maybe you have a management committee that might be responsible for that, right? What type of reporting should they be getting? How do you escalate things? All that happens kind of over here when you establish control and doing it together with third-party risk and contracting. And then the last piece is, for more mature organizations, if you have an internal audit function, something like that, is to really to make sure that they're aligned and things are working as they should, is to do those periodic assessments and testing of all your activities to ensure that everybody's kind of doing what they should be doing, and then cleaning up any gaps or areas where you need to make improvements. So that's that's my last bit of kind of thought I wanted to share with you. Was really this governance structure is key to everything. It's the glue that holds it all together. If you don't have these things, it's really easy for misalignment to happen, not only with contract and third-party risk, but with compliance and procurement and all the other pieces that go into managing that vendor relationship. So that's really what I've got primarily on the slides I wanted to share with you today. Melissa, I see we're at 12:49, so maybe we have time for one quick question, or I can turn it back over to you and Scott.
I'm going to let Scott take it from here, and then let's see if we have some more time for some Q&A.
Awesome. Tom, if you could flip to my slide, please, the start of it anyway.
Sorry, and I think we're going to share this deck, right, Melissa?
Totally your call.
We'll share the deck. Yep.
I want in it.
Yep. I've got, so you can reach out to me if any questions or inquiries. After but anyway, thanks, and I'll toss it over to you, Scott.
Yeah, you can keep going. Yeah, there we go. And just, we'll flip over to me. I've just got a couple points I want to cover on what Prevalent's perspective is on aligning contract lifecycle with third-party risk lifecycle. And it might be good for me just to kind of walk through a few things here, talk about our perspective, and give Melissa a chance to kind of triage all the questions that came in. Fantastic engagement, everyone, from all the questions you're asking. Definitely keep it up. Keeps these discussions lively, real, interactive, and kind of grounded in actual situations. So thank you for the engagement. Keep it coming. From our perspective, Tom kind of walked through a very holistic approach to looking at, how managing a contract, how managing CLM relates to managing a vendor. And, if you want to sum it up, it's a very time-consuming manual process. You're probably using a CLM tool in a silo that maybe doesn't have great interaction with the way you're assessing your vendor. And what that leaves is some disjointed views of the risk a vendor brings to you from a contractual perspective. Are they meeting their SLAs? Is the right contractual language in there? Versus how you're assessing the risk that the vendor brings to you inherently: security, IT-related risks, data privacy risks, reputational risks, whatever. It's also a version control nightmare that you well understand better than anyone else. But what it results in is that you can't really track details very effectively. Really doesn't give you great visibility into the contract or the life cycle. And what ends up happening? You got folks going rogue in the organization, maybe going outside of established contracting and purchasing cycles, maybe signing some paper they shouldn't be signing, and it leaves the business unprotected from a potential contractual problem in the future. It leaves you not in sync, and it can introduce a lot of business risk with all those real business consequences kind of back ending that. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is, if you're looking at CLM and TPRM differently, bringing them together holistically is the better path to go. Tom, next slide, please. Our approach on this is to offer a solution that fully integrates with the third-party risk management lifecycle, and the solution is called Contract Essentials. At the heart of the solution is the ability to centralize the creation, distribution, discussion, retention, and review of vendor contracts. We've implemented workflow into our solution that helps to automate the progression of that contract through its life cycle. And you can see a bit of a representation of that on the right-hand side. So that at the end of the day, you can treat contracts with the same level of discipline as you're treating other types of risks that come through the regular engagement with the vendor. So, we've got a couple of high-level capabilities available in the solution, built-in workflow to, again, help you automate the progression of contracts and review until a signature is obtained. And then the ability to then extract key contractual provisions or language that you can then automatically implement into, contractual SLA monitoring, for example. It's got built-in version control to allow you to, make changes and re-upload new versions, and then implement discussion tabs in there as well. So that if you just want to simply ask a question to the contract manager or internal procurement person, you can do that as well. Next slide, please, Tom. We see contract lifecycle management is its own thing, of course, and so is third-party risk, but we see contract lifecycle touching multiple stages of the third-party risk lifecycle. It isn't just about sourcing and selecting good vendors or simplifying the process of negotiating and kind of version control and upload and such, but also from an onboarding perspective, it's all making sure that you've got the review, the redlining, and approvals processes in place, so that when you make a decision on a vendor, you can quickly execute and get them onboarded, come to a contractual provision agreement, and then agree on what SLAs, and then move forward to more comprehensive due diligence, which means it's totally appropriate as you're measuring SLAs and performance throughout the life cycle, right? Sourcing and selecting vendors, intaking and onboarding, performing some level of inherent risk, doing due diligence assessments and remediation, validating those results through continuous monitoring their performance over the life cycle. And then finally, speaking to something that I think Tom is really clear about in the slides, was offboarding and termination. That gives you a central repository that's tracking not just final contractual requirements and obligations that have to be met, but how that aligns with the rest of your third-party, risk tasks, breaking access, cutting off physical access to systems, things like that. Next slide, please, Tom. Multiple different people throughout the enterprise is or can benefit from the integration of CLM and third-party risk. Legal folks who are managing contracts on a regular basis, they save a lot of time by automating those cumbersome processes, and more importantly, keeping their stakeholders updated and involved. Procurement shortens purchasing cycles by making sure everybody's adhering to the process, by offering it centrally and requiring everybody to kind of play into that system, and then looking, at contractual risks as well as business risks. And then IT security and risk management teams as well have a derivative benefit of reducing the risk of a downstream business disruption by making sure contracts have the provisions that are enforceable in the contract and can measure that throughout the life cycle as well. Next slide, please, Tom. And that just kind of aligns with the rest of our approach on managing third-party risk. We start out by offering you the ability to source and select a vendor appropriately through, RFX essentials, intake and onboard and contract with contract essentials, and then perform deep, inherent risk, and then ongoing due diligence, assessment, or remediation in our platform all the way through the life cycle, so that you can continuously reduce risks, not just from a contract perspective, but from a holistic risk perspective. Next slide, please. At the end of the day, our approach is founded on 3 driving principles. Number 1, we hope to make you smarter with regard to risk through a very data-driven and comprehensive approach that adds context. To help unify your processes and teams and break down silos, not just your risk and third-party teams, but also now legal and procurement teams as well. And to do it in a way that's prescriptive with built-in intelligence, recommendations, or mediations, so that everybody knows what's happening to everybody else at the same time, and you can produce great reporting, improve your organizational consistency and process, and eventually close the loop on risk from contracting, onward to offboarding. And that's really our approach to kind of how we address, third-party risk and CLM together. I'll stop talking now. We can open it up to questions. If you guys have questions for Tom, especially, or even a few for me, I'm happy to take those as well. Melissa, back to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Scott. We're going to go ahead and attack that Q&A box. But before we do that, I have one last question for you. Are you looking to augment or establish a third-party risk program in 2022 or even early 2023? I can't believe this year is halfway over. So answer it honestly. We're just curious to know, and we do follow up. As mentioned earlier, it will be either me or one of my counterparts, Amanda, Noel, or Landon. Regarding the Q&A, I have a question for you, Tom. How do you manage your contract control points with your critical vendors versus high-risk vendors?
Contract control points. So I think the question is, if I'm interpreting it right, it's the 4 kind of control points that I mentioned earlier, right? And is there a difference between managing or are they managed any differently with critical and high risk vendors versus others? I think might be the question, possibly. So I'll make my own interpretation. Okay. So I'd say the control points are the same. So there's no change in the control points with regard to whether the vendor is critical or not critical, or high risk or medium or low risk, right? Because let's think about, I know we're short on time, but one quick example might be, hey, let's say you have a modification. Originally, the vendor might have been segment or tiered as low risk, right? But let's say the modification turns them into high risk because now you decide to outsource something to them, or you've got a system you're buying from them. So it's really less about what risk classification they are in criticality, and it's more about the control point to apply that consistently across your entire vendor population. So I hope I interpreted that right, but there would be no change in the controls.
Perfect. Well, I mean, you timed that perfectly. We have about 1.5 minutes left. Can I ask one more question?
Yeah, sure.
All right.
I'll do it in 60 seconds or less.
All right. I'll read as fast as I can. Can you talk a little more about how to interface your risk SMEs and contracting experts with business owners who you mentioned may not have as nuanced a risk understanding? Any quick best practices for ensuring that nothing gets lost in translation?
Yeah, that's like an hour-long conversation. That one, that's a great question. That one's hard, right? It's really hard. And, the bigger you get, the harder it is. So I don't know that I have any quick answers to that, other than to say what we found that works really well is remember I talked about RACIs a little bit before. That process has helped a lot with a lot of our clients, because it makes them go through and really define their process, and also identify which stakeholders are involved at what points, and who needs to really be engaged and who just needs to be informed or consulted. So that it's kind of, so maybe my quick answer is starting with figuring out who they are and what their roles and responsibilities are. Maybe using something like a structured RACI model, right, will be the starting point. And then it's a matter of, all right, getting them to work together is like a completely different conversation. And that comes with some change management and training, coordination from the VMO as a quarterback to pull them in. But that RACI would probably be a good starting point if you don't have something like that already, because it really helps to clarify everything.
Perfect. Well, that's all the time we have for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this webinar. Thanks for your interaction as well. We gave you a lot to think about, I'm sure, and I will be seeing you in your inboxes shortly. Bye.
Thanks, Melissa.
Bye, everyone.